I'm a civil structural engineer. I've been in engineering for 40 plus years, 43 to be exact. Long time. Graduated from McGill in 1979, and during the period where there weren't very many jobs in Eastern Canada, I ran into a bunch of friends and they said, come to Calgary. The streets are lined with gold and lots of opportunities for engineers. So I moved out here and found a job fairly soon after arriving. Interestingly enough, I applied to Klohn Crippen Berger at the time. And the only reason I didn't take the job was because it took 2.5 hours to get there one way, because there weren't buses in Calgary weren't very frequent in those days. Well, actually, I didn't. My first thought was after high school was to become an architect, and I actually went through starting to get applications and so on. And in those days, you had to put together a portfolio as part of your application. And so I started to try and put together a portfolio of things that were architectural. And I soon realized that I didn't have that creative part of my brain, and decided, well, if I wanted to build things, which I really wanted to do, I would go into civil engineering. So that's how it began. How did it end up at KCB? That's an interesting question. My second job was with WR Engineering, and we were working on a project called 40 Mile Coulee. And Klohn Crippen Berger, Klohn in those days, were the prime consultant, and WR Engineering was the structure sub-consultant. So that's how I got to know Klohn originally. Interestingly enough, I worked with Bill Chin and Tom Murray at that time. And so our paths crossed really early, as all of us were starting our careers at about the same time. And so that's my first indoctrination with Klohn Crippen Berger. I moved on to Agri, Earth and Environmental, after we were bought out. WR was bought out. And I was the project manager on the St. Mary's Spillway project, and Klohn Crippen became our sub-consultant. So we changed roles a little bit there. And that's when I met Brian Rogers and continued with getting to know Klohn Crippen Berger. So again, we worked together on a lot of projects. We were their structure sub-consultant after I started my company, Mack in 1999. So I started my own company along with Chuck Slack in 1999, hence Mack Slack. And we continued working with Klohn Crippen Berger over that period of time. And I used to go down to the McGregor site with Tom Murray on a weekly basis for construction. And he kept saying, you guys should join us. So finally I said to Tom, if you guys are serious, you should make an offer. And they did. And in 2007, we joined forces with Klohn Crippen Berger. And it's been wonderful ever since. Well, as I indicated, I really want to build things, so I really enjoyed that aspect, and particularly in my role, I always stayed technical, even though I took on some managerial positions. I think Chuck and we always thought ourselves as working PMs. The clients we had always wanted to be able to call the project manager and find out what was going on, not only from a commercial aspect, but from a technical aspect. So Chuck and I both had to be very up to date on what was going on the technical side, and we kept our fingers in the technical parts of the project. So, I believe that's the part that really excited me about it. Well, I mentioned St. Mary's Spillway project, and that has to be the most challenging and my favorite, because it was at the kind of a crossroads in my career. Up until then, I'd been doing a lot of really interesting projects, but that was one of the first big projects where I was the project manager, handling multi-firms, multi-disciplines. And it was really, I think, defining moment in my career, because after doing that project, it really gelled my reputation in the industry. And I got to really know some very important people, as it turned out, in my career on the client side. And ultimately, that relationship was the basis for me being able to start my company, because they wanted to see my company and myself succeed. And when Chuck and I left to start Mack Slack, we didn't take any clients with us. We didn't even talk to clients about us going on our own. And when we did go on our own, they approached us and, like I said, wanted us to succeed. And they gave us opportunities to, via projects, to really springboard the start of our company. It's been a long haul, and so I've seen quite a bit. I think certainly the advancements of computers. I remember when we were WR, we were trying to impress a client and win a big project, and we bought our first computer. It was a 286, and nobody knew how to use it, but the client was coming in, so we plugged it into a wall with a printer and tried to make it look like we knew what we were doing. What advice would I give to a junior engineering consultant? What I would say is that stay curious and always continue to learn, and focus on your long-term goal in terms of making engineering a career. And I think you'll be successful if you do that. You're building your reputation. And all of those things, at the end of the day, go into making your career successful, making you successful, and making you resilient in terms of when there's a change in the economy, a downturn. If you've managed to build a really good reputation in the industry, you'll never be wanting work. There'll always be people that want to work with you. And I think, again, if you can keep that focus and focus on the long term as opposed to short-term money or short-term whatever, you won't regret it in the end. You will have, that successful career.